Welcome to the Classical Gabfest, a weekly discussion about the ever-changing world of classical music. I'm your host for this week, William White, and with me as always is Tiffany Liu, and this week we'll have a couple special guests with us while our normal co-host Kensha Watanabe is out. This week we'll be talking about the Movable Do podcast with its host Steve Danielson, and then we'll try out some of the latest musical variations of a hit word game. And finally, we'll take a look at the new YOLA Center in Los Angeles. But first, we like to start with our prelude segment. So, Tiffany, what do we have today?
This week, we'll be playing a round of everyone's favorite game, Game of Pairs. Here's how this game is played. I've chosen two composers who share a similar musical style. I'm going to play three selections that our contestants will listen to and try to guess who wrote each one of them. Here joining us, we have composer and conductor Steve Danielson of the Movable Do podcast, which we'll be discussing in our first segment. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Thank you. It is a pleasure being here today.
This week's composers are Morten Lauridsen and Jake Runnestad. Before we get into the game, let's briefly discuss what makes these composers' styles similar and different, and I'm going to learn a lot in the next 30 seconds.
Yeah, Steve, we're playing to your strengths here, I think. We've got a pair of very prominent American contemporary choral composers, Morten Lauridsen and Jake Runnestad. Tell us what you know about these people.
Well, Jake, I've actually talked to on my podcast. I don't know, they've got similarities. In the fact that they use the contemporary idea of the dissonance, these crunchy chords that don't always necessarily resolve.
Crunchy but pandiatonic, I would think.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, there's nothing too stretchy.
Mm-hmm.
Morten Lauridsen. It depends on what piece you picked. His style definitely shifted from his early works to his later works.
Oh, see, that's interesting. I don't know about that evolution.
Yeah, his early works I feel were a little bit stretchier, we could say, a little bit more outside the realm of that diatonic. Yeah. So it depends on what you're playing from him. Jake, I've heard several different iterations of his music.
I mean, Jake, we should say is a young composer. I mean, he's probably younger than I am.
Yeah.
And he is definitely an heir to this tradition of Morten Lauridsen, which probably passes through somebody like Eric Whitacre on its way to Jake's music.
Absolutely.
Very much in the pandiatonic realm of all of these kind of very light suffused chords, using the choir as sort of an organ almost, in building these large clusters and stuff. Am I on the right track here? I mean, I've sung a fair amount of his music.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to describe it. I think of Jake in comparing the two, I would say he's more of a storyteller in his music.
Mm-hmm.
I feel a lot more of a progression of a story throughout a piece than I do necessarily with Morten Lauridsen. So I don't know if we'll hear that in these pieces.
And did Morten Lauridsen, did he sort of invent this style? I mean, I give him credit for that, but he must have had forebearers. But I don't know, when I think of this very lush, gooey, almost schlocky kind of a choral sound, I think of him as making that almost from whole cloth.
Oh yeah, he was right there at the beginning of it. Yeah, it's like he discovered that and said, "Ooh, I'm going to keep using that for the rest of my career."
Yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, I have two comments. One is that, of course, the main reason that Whitacre doesn't make it into this Game of Pairs is, am I right in suspecting that you would almost certainly be able to pick out Whitacre? I mean, I feel like that would make the game too easy.
Very likely, yeah.
He has a much smaller oeuvre, right? I mean, Whitacre, there's probably 15 pieces or something. Maybe there's more, but I don't know. There's 15, and 5 of them get done over and over and over.
But the sound is so particular. I mean, there's something about what he does. I mean, I don't have any understanding of why I feel like all that music is so distinctively him and all sounds exactly the same. But am I on the right track here?
Oh yeah, He definitely has a sound. He knows he has a sound, and he likes to use that sound because he knows it's effective. But yeah, you're correct. I would most likely recognize.
But that's what's interesting. I mean, you got to give Whitacre credit somehow because, I mean, here are these 3 people that we're talking about who have very similar sound quality. I mean, using very similar techniques in the choir world. But Whitacre, I don't know, something stands out. Like, just the notes that he chooses, they're a little bit distinctive. All right. Well, anyway, I'm very curious to see how we're going to do on this.
All right. Let's do it.
All right. Well, here is your first excerpt. So neither of you recognize it right off the bat.
I don't recognize it.
No. I don't know that piece.
Good job, me.
I think it's Runnestad, though.
I was feeling the same thing. At the very beginning, I was thinking Lauritsen, but the swell there in the vocal and piano felt very Runnestad to me.
This is a piece called Prayer by Morten Lauritsen.
Oh wow. Interesting. Interesting. Wow, and good for you for finding a Lauritsen piece that we don't know too, because I mean he's another one with somewhat limited output.
Well, it is helped by the fact that his public appearance is so dramatically overshadowed by one selection, which is the O Magnum Mysterium, which I did know, so that I wasn't going to go there. Okay, here is your second excerpt.
What do you think, Will?
Well, Steve, I'll let you in on a little secret here. you know, we let you choose the game that we were playing today, and you chose a good one because there's usually a good way to get 1 point on this game, which is by playing the law of odds and assuming that the second one of the three that we listened to is going to be the composer who we didn't hear in the first one.
And I actually know this piece.
Oh, you do? Okay. So yeah, I mean, I'm guessing it's Runnestad, but I was helped by not only knowing the first excerpt, but just by hearing it and having this in comparison, because this does have a more contemporary sound than the first one by Lauritsen. You know, I mean, this does sound like a 30 to 40 year update of that musical style, I think, you know, with the way that the piano is a little bit more pianistic than the first one. I don't know. Maybe I'm digging my own grave here, but I would say that this is Runnestad. I think this is by a younger composer.
Yeah, this is definitely Runnestad. This is Come to the Woods. Beautiful piece. Very pianistic. Takes a very accomplished collaborative artist in order to make this piece work.
Yes, this is indeed Jake Runnestad's Come to the Woods. And there's something about the specificity of the piano, right? That it doesn't just serve as kind of a background or a support even chordally for the choir that I liked in this excerpt. Yeah, good job, guys. Okay, here is your third excerpt.
Steve, did you recognize this one right off the bat?
Not right off the bat. I think I might know it, but I don't want to dig my own grave and say anything. But going back to your argument from earlier, this sounds like an older compositional style than the Runnestad.
That's exactly what I came to mind. This sounds more like 70s, you know, influence at least. And what you said, which was news to me about how Lauritsen had this trajectory, this arc in his compositional career, going from maybe a slightly more modernist aesthetic to the contemporary gooey stuff that he has now. I would have to guess that this is Lauritsen and maybe an earlier work.
It feels like the earlier Lauritsen stuff that I had studied.
I mean, I don't know anything by Jake Runnestad that sounds remotely like this, but maybe we'll learn.
This is a piece called Midwinter Songs by Morten Lauritsen.
All right.
It was on Poems by Robert Graves and written in 1980.
Oh, okay. Wow. Yeah.
There we go.
We nailed it.
All right. Good. 3 out of 3.
No, 2 out of 3.
No, 2 out of 3. Sorry. 2 out of 3. Not bad. I would have gotten 0, probably. All right. And with that, we have concluded this week's Prelude segment. Before we wrap up, we'd like to remind our listeners that we do periodic listener-generated Name That Tune rounds, so we invite you to try and stump us. And now you know exactly how to stump me. Check our show notes, where you'll find a link to the form where you can upload a 30-second clip of an unidentified piece of classical music for us to try to identify. And with that, we move on to our first topic. Will, what do you have?
Well, listeners, you've already been introduced to our guest for today's first main segment, Steve Danielson. Steve and I happen to have a lot in common. We both live in the Seattle area, where we direct choruses and orchestras. We're both composers, and we're both podcasters. Steve's show, Movable Do, is a series of interviews with contemporary composers with a great format. On the first half of the episode, he asks them about their musical journeys, musical ideas, and work habits. And in the second half of the show, he presents their work by playing clips from several of their compositions and discussing what went into each piece and how it reflects some of their broader musical values and goals. I'm a big fan of Movable Do, and I am looking forward to being a guest on the show myself in the coming weeks. Steve, thanks so much for coming on the GabFest.
Thank you so much for having me, and that was a great introduction to my show. I think I'm going to steal that and type it up as the intro.
Yeah, fantastic. You're more than welcome to it. So let's get to talking about your show. I mean, you know, a lot of podcasts popped up during the pandemic times, the Classical GabFest very much being one of them. And there are a number of podcasts where composers are interviewed, but I find that yours is somewhat distinctive. So I wonder if you could talk about how you came up with the format and also how you choose which composers to have on the show, because there's like a bajillion composers out there. They're a dime a dozen. So what goes into this show?
I came up with the idea actually back in about 2017, but I was in the middle of my DMA studies at the University of Washington. I didn't really have time to pursue it and wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with it. Then comes the pandemic. My life sort of came to a screeching halt. You know, I was working as a substitute teacher, which didn't happen anymore after the pandemic started. Yeah. And I was tuning pianos, which I couldn't go into people's homes, so that didn't happen anymore either. So I suddenly had all this time on my hands, and so I pulled out this idea that I'd had and said, maybe I can make this happen. And so I started thinking about what I wanted to do for a name. And so the idea of Movable Do came up. You know, for singers, Movable Do is sort of our instrument. We don't have buttons or keys or anything to push, so solfege becomes our way of creating home base. So there's the movable do and the fixed do system. Fixed do means that C is always do, and movable do means whatever key you're in is do. And so I went with that idea that every composer has a different way of getting into composition. You know, I have my own story, but it's very different from yours, Will. You know, we have very different ways of how we got to where we are. And so I wanted to explore those stories, figure out how composers got into composition. And so everybody had a different starting place, much like a movable do system. And so I wanted to explore their stories and their music. You know, I'd listened to other podcasts with composers, and it was a lot of them were very sort of ethereal ideas about composition, or, you know, maybe focusing on one of their works. But I also noticed that a lot of them did not actually play clips of the music, which I found very frustrating. Mm-hmm. I wanted to hear the music that they were talking about. And so I made that a big point of my podcast. I want to include the music that you're writing. I want you to be able to let other people hear your music and get it out to a wider audience than you might otherwise be able to.
Yeah, without the music, what's the point? I mean,
right.
It's like, it's just, you know,
well,
read a book.
Well, that has to just be like an editing, like, I mean, okay, so like, Will, you've mentioned on our podcast before that the things that take you the longest to put together are in fact the things where you have to drop multiple clips of other items in them, right? Like our games and such. So I have to imagine that probably does play a role in what people choose to do in their podcasts.
Oh, sure. It definitely does give extra editing time, having to go back in and drop the clips in. But I find it's way worth it.
It's essential.
Yeah, the value add is like it's unquestionable.
Well, it makes it look like an actual produced thing rather than just you're a fly in the room kind of scenario.
Yeah.
And so now let's get back to this question about the composers who you have on your show, because I mean, it's certainly, I don't know, there's a certain consistency in there, I would say. I mean, you're mainly focusing on choral composers, but even if you just like limit the world to the world of choral composers, there's still so many.
Yeah.
So, I mean, are these mainly people whose music you have conducted or people you've worked with, or how do you go about finding your guests?
Yeah, so I started out, as I was brainstorming how to do this, I put a call out on a Facebook group I'm part of, and I said, hey, I'm thinking about starting this podcast. What composers would you like to hear from? You know, I'd like to especially help, you know, the little guy who's trying to get his foot in the door and help him expose people to his music. And I got a huge list of people that said, oh, contact this person, talk to this person, talk to this person. And a lot of them were names I didn't know. I think what helped me finally start the podcast was someone said, oh, my friend Sonder Choi said he would do your show. I'm like, great, I'll talk to Sonder Choi. I don't know Sonder, but I will talk to him because he said he'll be on my show. So he was my first interview. And I was super nervous. You go back and listen to that first one. It's a very different feel than later podcasts. But, you know, I stuck at the beginning a lot with people that I knew, people that I had met at conferences or friends of mine that are composers. But I also had a suggestion from that same thread on Facebook. Said, you know, if you want to give your podcast some clout, you need to get some bigger names, people that your listeners will recognize. And so I, you know, bit the bullet and I reached out to some people like Rollo Dilworth, Jake Runestad, and see these other names that bigger names to me. And so I was like, oh my gosh, can I actually interview them? But, you know, as the more I do this, I find, you know, composers are people just like I am. You know, I'm a composer. I love being interviewed and love talking about my music. And, you know, they're the same way. And they love the opportunity to be interviewed. So I've gotten less nervous about reaching out to the big names that I want to talk to. But at the same time, I can talk to people that are starting out in their careers. And so it's been a really eclectic mix. I mostly live in the choral world, so those are most of the composers that I know. But I have talked to people that do just orchestral stuff. Libby Larson comes to mind. Talked to Maura Smiley, who is more in the choral, but sort of this folk choral mix. I talked to Kurt Heinecke, who did the music for VeggieTales. And I talked to Wayne Lytle, who did the Anna Music video series. You know, I've talked to all sorts of different composers, and they all have fascinating stories.
So here's a question. I mean, you've now interviewed closing in on 50 composers, right?
Closing in on it, yeah.
What are some like big top level takeaways? Have you garnered anything from what all of these people have to say about working methods? Has anything that you've learned from these people influenced the way that you write your own music, for example?
I think the thing that I've taken away most is just don't give up. You know, just keep moving forward. You're doing what you love doing, and whether or not someone is publishing it is not really the important thing. You know, we compose music because it's something that's inside of us that has to come out. And, you know, some people do really well with the commission format, and they get commission after commission after commission, and they're getting that. And other people, they don't get the commissions, and they write from their heart because that's what's there. And you just keep moving forward. Because, again, we're all approaching it from a different starting point. And so not everyone's going to have the same working method. Not everyone will have the same time. Not everyone will have the same abilities. But that doesn't mean that we can't keep writing.
This is great advice and one that I'm going to try to take, because it applies obviously in other fields that are not composing, and I'm going to take it to heart myself. I am thinking that there may be folks out there who listen to that advice and say, well, you're interviewing all the successful people.
I am, and I'm not. You know, I've interviewed people that are sort of in the beginning of their careers as well. People that are just starting out, don't have anything officially published, selling stuff off their websites. But it's the same idea. Just keep moving forward, keep doing it. You know, we're not all going to be the next Eric Whitacre. We're not all going to be, you know, John Williams. We're not all going to reach that level, but that doesn't mean that we can't fill the world with good music. You know, one of the interviews I did with Rosephine Powell, I asked her specifically about the idea of imposter syndrome, because that's something I've struggled with in my life. Am I actually fitting into this world of composers or conductors? I went through a long period of, am I good enough in that? And she just really, I said, do you ever struggle with imposter syndrome? And she thought for a second and said, no, I just keep feeling that I am blessed to be doing what I'm doing. And that just sort of took me back and said, I need to be more grateful for the world I'm in, for the opportunities I have, that I have the chance to sit down and compose music. In my busy life with all the things I have going on, that I have a chance that I can sit down and create something that hasn't been in this world before that I can share with other people. And I thought that was a wonderful moment.
Or any other effects that it's had on your life?
So I think the biggest thing that I've taken away is just the networking possibilities. I've reached out and made contact with so many wonderful people through this podcast that I wouldn't have known before and wouldn't have had the courage to just reach out and email. And it's been a wonderful opportunity. I mean, the fact that I'm talking to you today is a result of my podcast. And so I'm extremely grateful for the people that I have met along the journey.
Yeah, I think that we've also been pleasantly surprised by how willing people are to come and talk on a podcast. But it's like people really love the sound of their own voices, and none more than me. So I really am excited about coming onto your podcast. I mean, I don't get that many chances to just talk about my work as a composer. So it's certainly an honor to be able to go on your show, which is going to happen in the next week here. I think that episode will probably be released later in March or April or something like that.
It will, yeah. In fact, I can tell your listeners right now that your episode is actually set for March 15th. So it's going to be the second episode in season 4. So, yeah, listeners can look forward to that one.
Well, I definitely encourage listeners to listen to that episode. But more than that, I would encourage them to go back into the back catalog, which is really pretty deep at this point. I've listened to many of these episodes, and I've gotten some really interesting insights, and there are a lot of composers whose work I've performed or sung or whatever like that. And so it's a great show, Steve, and thanks for coming on and talking about it.
Well, I appreciate having the opportunity. Thanks a lot.
And Steve will be rejoining us for our classical mixtape segment, but in the meantime, time for our second topic. By now, I'm sure that most, if not all, of our listeners are familiar with the hit word game that took the internet by storm last month, Wordle. Begun as a programmer's side project and now a property of the New York Times, this daily game asks players to guess a 5-letter word in 6 guesses and provides the bare minimum of clues to get you there. Wordle has spurred the creation of a number of knockoff games, including variations in several languages and versions that alter the rules slightly. And of course, musicians have not been immune to the fun, which is why today we are going to talk about 3 musical Wordle challenges: Byrdle, Chordle, and Musicle. And to discuss these with us, we have everyone's favorite unofficial official intern, Joseph Vaz. Now, I have the distinct impression that I'm speaking with perhaps the only 2 people on the face of the planet who have not gotten addicted.
We're immune to the fun, okay?
Yes, who are immune to the fun, who have not gotten in on the Wordle craze. Am I correct in assuming that?
You're wrong for me. I've been playing for probably a month now.
Ooh, okay. Joseph is a
so you were
wordler.
just stereotyping with Joseph.
Yeah, Joseph, but was that a poor guess on my part about you? I mean, you're not like the most internet-y guy that I know.
Yes, I do try to stay off the internet a little bit, but I guess this is an exception because I find it fun. The fun is waning already, but I still do it morningly.
I mean, I love word games. I'm a big fan of, especially the New York Times suite of word games. I do a lot of spelling bee. I do a lot of crossword. So, I'm not going to say that I don't, enjoy this. But when I see, 50 of one thing crop up on my social media, I kind of roll my eyes a little bit, and then I do something else. But this is a great game. It's a great game.
So, all right, we know what Wordle is, essentially. Let's talk about this first variation, which is called Byrdle, Byrdle, which is essentially Wordle for choral nerds. And this is the traditional Wordle setup. You're trying to guess a 5-letter word. You've got the normal number of guesses. You've got the same rules, and the game shows you where you've gotten the correct letter, if it's in the right place, if it's in the wrong place. But basically here, the variation is just that it's a very limited vocabulary. So like examples of the word might be motet or choir, spelled with a Q in the English way. Any number of things. I don't know. What did you guys think of this one? Did you do it, and were you able to get it?
I did this one. I don't think I quite understood that it was supposed to be all music terms. My first guess was rapid, which I guess is like a music term, but it doesn't really have to be. And it just accepts any word that the original Wordle accepts.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
So I was a little thrown off by that at the very beginning. I guess we can say today's word, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Today's word was forte, and when I was told that at the end, after missing on all 6 of my guesses, then I understood what I need to do tomorrow. Guess exclusively music terms.
And do you think that this is one that you would play again? Like if you're a daily Wordle player, does this have enough enticement as being a musician to warrant playing it as well?
I'm not a choral nerd, but it seems like forte isn't really exclusive to choral musicians. So I think I might play it again just to see if I can get some music terms that are not exclusive to choral music in there. Otherwise, it works exactly the same as Wordle, and it's more limiting, I suppose.
So if this were a musical, like, they name it Byrd after William Byrd, of course, and choral composer, spelled Byrdle. And it's all very clever and well done. And actually, there's a Twitter thread explaining past answers to Byrdle, which of course is mostly what I want to know is like, what am I limiting myself to in terms of, guesses? And my issue is that I'm exactly what Joey said, which is not choral nerd, which means that I'm not going to get to answers like Byrdle number 13, Dyson, Dyson, Sir George Dyson, musician and composer who lived from 1883 to 1964.
Yeah, and I would say about this too, Tiffany, is that this is a very British choir.
So they have breve, and they have what's the word that they use for? There was one.
Minim.
Yeah, minim, and also clerk.
Clark.
Is that really how they say that?
Oh yes.
Well, it's spelled like clerk.
Yes.
Like the job. And it says a lay clerk is a professional adult singer in a cathedral choir in the UK. I mean, I'm never gonna get there.
Yeah, there's a lot of Latin terms on here, sicut, and altar, which is that's a bit of church terminology. I mean, so this is very much like Church of England, Anglican choral scholars. This is for them, Yeah. Now, we happen to chance upon a good day for us that was just forte. But I don't know, if people are into that kind of stuff, then...
Yeah, have at it. I mean, it's fun. It's
have
really,
at it.
And it's nice that they have this Twitter thread explaining the past answers.
Okay, now let's talk about Chordle, which is sort of Wordle for music theory nerds. The idea here is that you're given essentially the 12 pitches of the Western chromatic scale, and you get to make a 4-note chord out of them. So it could be a C dominant 7 chord if you type in C, E, G, B flat. What did you guys think of this? Joey, did you try this one out?
I loved this one because literally the other day, this isn't a verifiable statement, but I was talking with a musician friend who also plays Wordle, and we more or less came up with this game in our conversation, or at least the concept for the game. So I'm very excited to see that it's a real thing. It was a joy to play, and I'm definitely going to keep playing it.
Wow, interesting. It was a joy to play. Quite a rave from young Joseph here.
Well, there are only a few options, right? Because it allows all types of 7th chords,
right.
4-note chords built in thirds, and you only have 4 guesses. So this isn't going to take very much out of my day, and it's a fun little puzzle, much like Wordle.
And it should be said that they are allowed in inversions as well. So like today's was a D flat major 7 chord in first inversion.
Right.
But Tiffany, you did not have a rave.
Well, okay, so I have several questions based on the description, which are all I have to go on because I actually didn't get this game to work. But before I get to that, I mean, it's 7th chord. Is it only 7th chords, like no triads?
Yeah, it's only 7th chords because you have to fill in 4 notes.
Only the diatonic seventh chords are allowed, and it lists dominant seventh, minor seventh, half diminished seventh, and major seventh. And for music theory nerds, they explain even more in detail. Chords can be in any inversion. All chords must be in close position, which means that all notes fit within the span of an octave.
Okay, now I know what's going on. So you're only allowed to enter chords at all. It's not like you can enter like a random selection of notes and just see, which was my mistake. That was what I was doing. So yeah, okay, sounds good to me. I mean, the fact that it's limited to seventh chords, I think, is unfortunate. Like I feel like there's too many restrictions on this. That's my impression. I mean, because there's a world of other kinds of chords, and I know that the trouble with designing this is how do you limit the number of chords so that it's actually guessable. So I guess they've done a good job of that. But my feeling, just reading it and having played it once now, is like seventh chords is just very limiting, right? I would imagine that at least this should be open to like triads with the octave or something like that. I don't know.
It's fair enough, I think. I'm like meh on this. Like, I think it's fine. I would do it in a moment of boredom. My problem is that I've got a very busy Wordle schedule every day because I play Wordle, and then I play Le Mot, which is the French Wordle, and then I play Parole, which is the Italian one, and then I play WORDLE, which is the German one. So, that takes up like a half an hour right there every day. So whether I have room for this in my busy schedule, I don't know. Now, the final one is very interesting here. This is called Musicle, and it was invented by a classical GabFest listener Adriano, who has submitted to our Name That Tune before, and he tweeted this to us. He said, "Stumping the hosts of the Classical GabFest is so much fun that I created a game to do it automatically every day." So, Joseph, you're the expert on our Name That Tune segment. Why don't you describe to us how this works? What is listener Adriano unleashed upon the world here?
So this one is a little bit different in terms of the actual way that it works. Musicle, spelled Musicle, has 3 excerpts each day. For each of the excerpts, you are given 4 options for what the piece is, and you have to guess which of those 4 options you're hearing.
Well, and let's clarify this a little bit, because it's not even really what the piece is. You're played a small clip from a recording, and you have to guess what album the recording came from.
I don't think that's true, because they have the album, and underneath the album, they have a name of a piece.
Oh, I see. So when you click on the album cover, then below it specifies a piece on that album.
Exactly.
Okay, so you have to kind of click through here. Well, that actually makes it a little bit easier.
Quite a bit easier, yes.
And so, Joseph, what did you make of this? Did you get it, and did you enjoy playing it? And did you put it on hard mode? That's the other question.
What was hard mode? I didn't even see that.
Hard mode limits it to 5 seconds of the excerpt, whereas I think that regular mode is like, what, 10, 30, something like that?
I see. No, I didn't put it on hard mode. So I got to hear plenty, maybe around 30 seconds, just like in the original. Mm-hmm. And I really did enjoy playing it because it's not quite as hard as your all Stump the Hosts, wherein the entirety of classical music is what you're choosing from. But it's not so easy as to be not worth playing.
Yeah, maybe I'll use this to practice for Stump the Hosts.
Yeah, that's true. It could be our little workout here.
I mean, I love this game. I really, It's not really Wordle, right? It's like, it's not Wordle. Here's a, and like the only thing that makes it like Wordle is that there's 3 of them, but like the order of them is not, you know what I mean? Like you don't get anything from the selection of 3 different album selections. Like there's no inherent meaning in these particular 3 selections in this order.
Right.
So it bears kind of a cosmetic resemblance to Wordle, but I love this as a sort of like, oh, can you hear something, and with some parameters, which is often what I'm missing in Stump the Hosts, make a logical guess as to what it is. And like, that's fun. That's really, I enjoy the radio game of Name That Tune, like, because I know some more parameters sometimes than I get in Stump the Hosts. And also the radio DJ is not usually trying to stump me, but no, I think this is great. And I'm very like, I don't know, Adriano, like, You have a lot of time on your hands.
I think it's amazing. I mean,
really,
boy.
And there's even other genres. Like I'm gonna click through the other genres here and like play, just like get to jazzle, all that. Like this is great. This is awesome.
I assume that Adriano is manually choosing all of these options each day?
See, I don't think he is. And frankly, I mean, I actually think that makes it harder because he said in his tweet, I created a game to do it automatically every day. I mean, there's no way that he's getting up every morning and like chopping up these clips or whatever. I think that he must be using something like Apple Music or Spotify to power this. And it would be nigh on impossible to do were it not for the fact that he gives you 4 album covers or four possible selections that it could come from. And, the thing that does make it hard is that because I believe it's automated and randomized to a certain extent, a human didn't choose the clip to give you any kind of little insight musically about what it might be.
Or stump you.
Or to stump you. Right, exactly. So, I mean, like when I was playing today, I missed the second one, which ended up being a selection of Charles Ives' Symphony No. 4.
Same.
But I was playing on hard mode, and I only got 5 seconds, and it was just a piano and a violin. Yeah. So I chose that it was something from this Webern album of the complete Webern opus.
That's exactly what I did.
Yeah, and so, but what I didn't realize is that, if you click on that, it told me that the selection from that album, if I had known this, what Joey told me, was Passacaglia Opus 1. Well, I'm actually familiar enough with Passacaglia Opus 1 to have known that it couldn't be from there.
I actually like the game without knowing what Joey told us. I like the game a lot without it because there's an album, and I like kind of that the album has something that's narrow enough that I might not know the entire thing. Like it's very unlikely that I'm going to know every note in an album, but it's like much more likely that if I know a piece and it is the one, then I will be able to say yes or no.
Right. Or a lot of it, you can narrow it down. Mm-hmm. The albums are not all obvious feints. Yeah. It's not like when we play Two Truths and a Lie, where something has been engineered to make you think that it might be something. Like some of them you can just rule right out. Anyway, I think he's done a great job with this.
It's a virtuosically coded. Yeah. Like it's very pretty, like the grabbing of the album art is like really good. It's seamless and not buggy at all. Like I'm super impressed. And I'm bookmarking it right now.
Listener Adriano, we give you all the props in the world. We are so honored that you took your inspiration from stumping our dumb asses to make this gift for the world. And Classical Gabfest listeners, get at Musicle.
Awesome.
This is fantastic. The link will be in our show notes. All right, with that, on to our third topic. Tiffany.
Last fall marked the opening of a 25,000 square foot arts center in Inglewood, California, now known as the Judith and Thomas L. Beckman YOLA Center, YOLA standing, of course, for the Youth Orchestra Los Angeles. In addition to its youth programming, the Beckman YOLA Center is billed as a space for music educators from across the U.S. and around the world to collaborate and learn, acting as the focal point of the LA Phil's commitment to community engagement in the area. It was designed by architect Frank Gehry and built in conjunction with LA Film Music and artistic director Gustavo Dudamel. YOLA is certainly on an upward climb, and perhaps another enormous data point in this observation is that the Inner City Youth Orchestra of LA under Maestro Thomas Wilkins was featured in the Superbowl a couple weeks ago, accompanying gospel duo Mary Mary in the anthem Lift Every Voice and Sing. The controversy over the enormously expensive SoFi Stadium that hosted the Super Bowl throws the Beckman Center into an interesting conversation regarding community investment, gentrification, and affordability. The $23 million price tag on the Beckman Center, a renovation of an old bank building, is positively dwarfed by the cost of the stadium, which is over 200 times that much to design and build. LA Times columnist Mark Swed observes that the YOLA program is free to join, while on the other hand, the cheapest nosebleed seats on the day of the game rang in at just over $1,300. What is the meaning of architecture as it relates to art and music, and how does the physical design and presence of arts centers change and interact with community around it? Let's talk about it a little bit. Have either of you guys seen other press about this center? I mean, it opened in the fall. I don't think it kind of rang in my radar much.
No, I didn't come across it until I saw that article by Mark Swed about pitting the Yola Center against the this huge football stadium or whatever that they played the Super Bowl at.
Yeah, well, we'll take it that the opening of the Art Center kind of made the local news probably, and not much more than that, right? But it is kind of an interesting conversation, especially just having had the youth orchestra being under such national spotlight in the Super Bowl this past weekend, and then for such a heated conversation about the stadium to have thrown this into an interesting kind of relief. Any thoughts about that? I mean, have you guys been impacted by like really pretty art centers and how they relate or don't relate sometimes to the community around them?
Oh, yeah. I mean, this sort of continues our discussion a little bit about musical venues that we had before. And I think that the beauty of a space really does matter when you're playing in it. It can be very inspiring to do a concert in a beautiful space, not only one that's acoustically excellent, but also one that's visually stunning, that is architecturally designed to give you a sense of awe. I mean, frankly, a lot of these types of spaces are more found in Europe than they are in the United States. I mean, there are a few exceptions here. But, what I like about this space a lot, if you look at the designs, and we can post some links in our show notes that show how it was designed and show how it looks in the community. What I think is great about this space is that it's got this glass facade. So you can see into it. You can see what's going on inside. You can watch, the concert, even if you can't hear it. And although they probably have speakers outside, I don't know. That would be a Frank Gehry hallmark. Like if you look at his New World Center in Miami Beach, you can sit out on the lawn and they've got this huge simulcast screen and you can hear what's going on inside. But the fact that this removes that barrier of the facade so you can see what's happening is, I think, a very impressive thing. And the fact that it's so attractive in what it looks like inside, and the way that it's modular, and I'm sure we'll talk about that, about how it has multiple different setups for the different functions that it's going to entail, versus, concerts versus rehearsals. This just seems like a big success, and I think that I'm not like the hugest Frank Gehry fan in the world. I think his stuff is pretty cool, but the fact that he designed it for this purpose is amazing.
Yes, all of the articles that we read really emphasized the fact that people walking by can look in and see the music educational work going on inside. I imagine that YOLA is going to benefit greatly in terms of enrollment just from this.
So, of course, the counterpoint that I mentioned in the introduction is the SoFi Stadium, which, obviously is very expensive to build, and people have been talking about, its impact on the community, displacement, and gentrification. Have you guys ever felt a dissonance between a beautiful space and the area around it?
All right. So I have become a avowed urbanist, or I have always been an urbanist, but in recent months I've been able to put that terminology to it. Mm-hmm. And I think that the distancing that happens with a space and its community is all about city design. And it has to do with surface parking and distance to get someplace, and a lack of integration into the surrounding community. And, look, I'm not a stadium guy. I'm not a sports guy. I think it's ridiculous that our tax dollars are spent on these agora for American blood sports. Like, I'm not a fan. I think it's really bad. But, football's very popular. So what are you going to do? A lot of people want their tax money to be spent on this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But there is a way to make stadia a part of a city. Like, if you look at a place like Barcelona, where the soccer stadium is really integrated. Like, most people can walk there or take public transportation there. And it's surrounded by businesses and it's surrounded by dwellings. It's not set apart. That is what is alienating, is when you go someplace, you have to drive someplace like an hour away from where you live. You park in an enormous surface parking lot. Then you have to walk into the stadium, and finally you get to be where you are. And then you're surrounded by the hubbub of life again. That's, I think, the problem here. And I don't know what the walkability score of this part of Inglewood is, but it looks to me like they're at least trying to encourage that kind of a thing. I don't know. What do you think, Tiff?
I think you're right to bring urban planning into this. I mean, your mention of surface parking and like obviously LA, like everybody thinks it's traffic when you think of LA. Like it's all you can think about. It's it's your whole life. And so I think you're completely right to bring in aspects of urban planning into these. My other thought about this, I mean, one thing that makes it easy to be a little bit cynical about building pretty spaces is like, well, then you're thinking, okay, who can afford to go in there? And this columnist makes an interesting point about, well, YOLA programs are free to join. You know, you can afford to be in this building. But then that sets up a challenge to what we have come to think of just sort of American capitalism, which is that like, well, if you can't afford a space, then why would you, like, then how are you going to make it possible? And the only reason this space got built, right, is through philanthropy. It's the only reason. And so our whole field kind of faces this same question of like, okay, well, if we cannot be commercially viable, how do we justify ourselves to the world? And why should we need to is a whole other question, right? But it does kind of bring into relief that entire structure of support that we as musicians and artists usually just depend on.
Yes, and it's true. We do depend on that philanthropy, but I would say that there is an unseen philanthropy that many of these quote unquote, perfect capitalist enterprises rely on as well. The perfect example being these sports stadiums. These sports stadiums are built, first of all, on huge amounts of debt financing, and that debt is usually financed by the taxpayers. Right. So, I mean, they are being philanthropized as well, but we just don't see it.
You don't see it, and then on top of that, they use the enormous cost of that, the social cost and the physical footprint and all that to justify charging $1,300 per seat for the Super Bowl.
Right.
It's
exactly.
It's all, and they're just passing the cost on. So, in a sense, like, I do think of this center as a good model of philanthropy in which, philanthropy funded the thing. It used a footprint that already existed in the area, it was a renovation of an old bank, and it doesn't pass on the cost to the lowest level of society that you would want to come and enjoy it.
The other bit of philanthropy that we also, is very visible, but we don't think of as being philanthropy is the huge sponsorships, right? I mean, like here, we in Seattle, we just opened up this new Climate Pledge Arena, which is funded by Amazon for the hockey team. Or like, isn't in LA, is one of the big stadiums is now the Crypto.com stadium. Yeah. So it's like, if that's not philanthropy, I don't know what is. it's advertising
it's
too,
corporate
of course.
Philanthropy.
It's corporate philanthropy.
Yeah, which we don't do that well with.
Right, exactly. And this also comes back, I think, to a little bit about the discussion of the perception of elitism that we've had in classical music. Because a lot of people see a concert hall and they think, oh, that's for those snooty, hoity-toity elitists. Whereas, like, half of the tickets are going to be given away, gratis. And then, like, the football stadium, that's for the common man. But it's like, well, this is going to be $1,300 Super Bowl tickets, and then it's going to be, on its off night, it's going to be like probably $1,000 Rolling Stones tour, world tour tickets.
Okay, I'm going to pivot a little bit to a different question, which is that I have, and I bet you two have as well, been part of an organization that maybe has undergone a major renovation of the hall that they live in that is kind of, bringing it up to a different level and making it pretty and all this kind of stuff. And post-renovation, there usually comes to be some sort of kind of larger administrative shift. And often that administrative shift is, devoted towards like bringing in other art and kind of making it more kind of marketable. And then at the end, what happens is the only people who have access to this space are the people who can pay money for it, because then the demand gets higher. So like there is this fear as well, right? It happened with the building that I used to rehearse in with my youth orchestra. All of a sudden there was this like larger administration and our orchestra could no longer really like even get the dates that we wanted to perform. It was things like that. So is there a risk of that here?
I don't know, because I don't know what the other uses of this happening are. I guess it's not much because YOLA is like a daily after school program. It's not like the youth orchestra that I used to direct, which was a once a week youth orchestra. And that's what, a lot of the very elite youth orchestras in this country are a once a week kind of a program. So you would think that they would want to be using this space for something when the kids aren't meeting, but the kids are meeting like a huge portion of the time is my impression. But it's also, I think that this is attached to Inglewood High School. I can't remember if that's in fact the case. And if it is, and I hope that it is, I hope that the school ensembles are using it during the day. And even if it's not attached to the high school, I hope that like the that the school district is also being able to partake of this very valuable resource, which is so good for a very specific purpose. Yeah. And it seems like it could be used for the classes and stuff.
I mean, let me just read some copy from their website. It's supposed to be a rehearsal and recording space for, other folks. It's an international teaching center. It hosts teacher training and conventions for music educators from around the world. It's supposed to be like a community, learning hub kind of thing as well. I mean, there is going to be a portal where people who are not involved with LA Phil or YOLA can use the space, right? Like that's what all of that says to me.
Now, of course, Tiffany, the danger could be in a city like Los Angeles, which has such a thriving recording industry. This could arguably turn into some kind of a movie music recording studio.
Yeah.
And frankly, if it's free from 9 to 11 a.m. and or 9 to 12 a.m. because kids aren't rehearsing then I think that would be good for that. But yeah, you don't want it to become like a profit-driven enterprise.
I mean, somebody, as focused, socially focused as their mission seems to be right now, like all it takes is for one president of, of this center to come in and say, well, if, Hollywood wants to come in and spend multi-million dollars for this, spot and it's only displacing one rehearsal, all it takes is that kind of thinking.
Yeah.
And I'm not even denigrating that kind of thinking actually, because again, you have to fund the thing. You have to fund the operation of the thing. So why not take multi-millions of dollars from Hollywood who can obviously afford it, So, but it does set up this kind of potential conflict that maybe is not as much present in like a YMCA or something, right? Anyway, well, it looks pretty. I hope I get to see it someday. I'm a music educator, right? Can I come visit?
Yeah, you should go to a conference there. It looks really cool. I mean, people should just look at, just even the mock-ups or the videos that were made about it. It's very, very neat.
Well, kudos to the Youth Orchestra of Los Angeles, and hope to see more great things coming from that organization. Let's go on to our classical mixtape. Joey?
In our classical mixtape, we each recommend some music that's caught our ear this week to share with our listeners. Steve Danielson is back with us for this segment. And Steve, I understand that you've taken a break from talking to other composers about their works to talk with us about one of your works. Why don't you tell us about the piece you've chosen for us?
Sure. So I decided this week that I was going to share Take Me Back, a New American folk song. So this is a piece I wrote for my high school group back in 2015. We were taking a trip to New York. We were going to be performing on the 80th floor of the Empire State Building. And so I wanted something new. I was going to, something new that we could take there. So I sat down and I started thinking about where music is going. And I kept sort of thinking back to the past, back when people used to just sing together all the time, folk music, where people would just gather in their homes and sing together. And I loved that idea. So I started writing out these words about looking back to help us move forward, and came up with this Take Me Back idea. Take me back to the time when people used to sing, and wrote it in a style very much like Skip to My Lou or Bile Them Cabbage Down or one of those classic folk songs that people used to sing together. And put it together. We sang it in New York. And then when I moved here to Washington, I started working with the Ensign Symphony and Chorus and decided to orchestrate it as well. And so the recording we're going to hear is the Ensign Symphony and Chorus performing this in 2019.
Conducted by the composer.
That's right.
Well, thanks for that, Steve, and thanks so much for being on the show today.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks again for having me.
Will, what do you have for us this week?
I just felt that I haven't recommended music by Alfred Schnittke recently enough. I've actually been reading. Actually, thanks to Joey, I've been reading some other books about Schnittke lately. It turned out that I hadn't read all of them. Joseph pointed this out to me, so I decided I had to read the one or two that I hadn't actually read. This is one of my favorite pieces by Alfred Schnittke. This is his second string quartet. I'm going to play the second movement here, and it's just a wild frenzy of a piece. It just requires the strings to just go hog wild on their instruments, and it is fantastic.
Is that a common Schnittke thing? I think, isn't one of the cello sonatas second movement also extremely perpetual motion, very difficult?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's one of his stocks in trade.
Got it. Well, thanks so much for that. Tiffany, what do you have for us?
Well, in my preparation of this week's game and our conversation with Steve, I ventured over to the other side, and this is one of the results. This is Percy Grainger's arrangement of the English folk song Brigg Fair, which I only knew through Friedrich Delius's orchestral arrangement of the same. But this is a really beautiful arrangement of this song by John Rutter and the Cambridge Singers.
It was on the 5th of August, and the weather fine and fair, unto Brigg Fair I did repair, for love I was inclined. I rose up with a lark in the morning, with my heart so full of glee, of thinking there to meet my dear, long time I'd wished to see.
Well, that was just beautiful. Thank you, Tiffany. For myself, this week I am bringing some Monteverdi. I've been listening to just about everything he wrote for the past few weeks, and from his 5th book of madrigals, I'm bringing Cruda Amarilli.
So Joseph, you and I have been having some offline conversations as you've made your way through Monteverdi, and early on you said that you were not able to find anything that appealed to you by Monteverdi. You thought he was totally overrated. So have you come around? What's the deal here?
Yes, it seems like he hit his stride around the 4th book of madrigals, and I changed my mind accordingly. You'll find the links to all these and to our full classical mixtape playlist in the show notes.
And with that, it's time to wrap up this episode of the Classical Gabfest. I'm William White, and on behalf of Tiffany Liu, Joseph Vaz, and Kensho Watanabe, who will be with us next week, I'd like to thank you so much for listening and to encourage you to subscribe and rate us on your podcast app. We'd also love your help spreading the word about the show on social media, where you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can reach us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com, and we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, happy listening, and we'll be with you next week.